This is the Raw and Radical Women in the Arts podcast, and I am your host, Maureen Broadbeck.
Raw, unprocessed.
In each episode, we explore the mechanisms of identity, vulnerability, authenticity, empowerment, and social change through conversations with inspiring women who are making history and challenging the status quo in both the art world and in society.
Radical, rebel, progressive.
We talk about their real-life challenges and celebrate cis and transgender women so that you can be inspired, empowered, take action, and further your critical understanding about what it means to be a woman in the arts.
Woman, feminism. A revolutionary catalyzing reformation. Radical.
For the first episode of this year, let's welcome Dana Hoey, an American artist and photographer born in San Francisco and based in upstate New York. Dana received a BFA in philosophy from Wesleyan University and an MFA in photography from the Yale School of Art. She exhibited at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., Albany University Museum of Art, the Center for Art, Design and Visual Culture at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. Her work investigates discordance, discomfort, aggression, society and power, and how those relate to the identity of women through photographs and video. She blurs the lines between facts and fiction and investigates the role of women in society. She brings art and the concept of social engagements together through boxing that she uses in her installations, performances, and she brings self-defense class in the art spaces. She is represented by Petzl Gallery in New York City. Let's listen to what she has to say. Let's welcome Dana Hoey. Hi, Dana. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Good morning. Good afternoon
morning.
to you.
Yeah. So your work has always been about women. You are investigating women and their social roles. Could you tell us why and what got you interested in this subject?
Yes, I can. I grew up in the country, and when I moved to New York City, I found there were some amazingly complex social codes that I wasn't necessarily understanding. So I decided to, number one, research them, and then number two, kind of visualize what it would be like if the social codes were a bit simpler and more direct.
And then what did you discover and how did you use it in your work?
What I discovered was with the white American woman, there's a certain degree of circuitous aggression or passive aggression, and there's less speaking directly to each other when we have a problem. And so I had the fantasy of what it would be like if we were more direct. And the way that I used it in my work was I directed multiple women to wrestle around and fight with each other. That was the most direct conflict I could think of. And then I photographed them at that time, kind of in the aftermath, so that they had glowing out of their eyes the aftermath of having had a direct exchange, a direct physical exchange. So that's how it began.
And do you feel like this glow, it made it more real for people?
Oh, sure. For sure, yeah. Definitely made it more real. It's also a directing technique to have people do physical things because I didn't work with actors. So working with non-actors, you need to do something physical to relax and get less self-conscious.
All right. So how did you get about that to make them have this kind of engagement and reactions and, to really open that way?
Yes. Well, I just asked, and it was more and less awkward, but it doesn't matter how awkward it was. People still relaxed. I think sometimes if you do something awkward, you can relax afterwards. So that's what happened. And often I would photograph people who didn't know each other. So it was a built-in kind of discomfort that we would allay with the wrestling around and that kind of thing.
Oh, okay. Your work circles around this question of masculinity and femininity and the myth around it. And there's violence and aggression in it. Could you explain your point of view on these themes of violence and aggression?
Yes, I think that, usually violence and aggression are associated with what would be called toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
And I definitely understand that, especially in this country, we have a major problem with it. However, I think that violence can also be consensual and it can be loving as well. That's been my experience in combat sports. And the reason that I became interested in this dangerous territory is because of, again, that sort of passive aggression of the American in particular, culturally, the white woman in America, that sort of tendency to act like a helpless victim, then to become aggressive in a backwards and indirect way. I felt
Mm.
like just to express oneself physically, particularly in combat sports, was so like healing for people who work that way. So although I do become adjacent to what you might call toxic masculinity, the difference is that I only deal with violence when it is 100% consensual, only if it's consensual. So, because I do believe there are, of course, real victims in the world, and I
Yeah.
don't take that lightly. But I know many people for whom consensual sort of combat sports, consensual violence is completely an act of love too. So, if people are made differently that way.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting because this idea of toxic masculinity, it's a real societal problem. And I think it is the basis of so many conflicts in the world and in between people in society. And
Yes.
it's so important to address that. So,
Mm.
to your point of view, how did it got created? Why is it still there? How comes people cannot overcome this?
You know, I've sort of made it a policy not to speak for or about men as much in my work, because I feel like whoever has the power is not going to let go of it easily. So I feel like it's more on the woman to use the tools of the dominant class to elevate themselves.
Mm.
So the toxicity of masculinity, I don't know how to solve that. It's so out of control in this country. I mean, I drive down the street and there are trucks that have been modified so that they exude more pollution, and they're called coal burners, and every man of a certain age drives a massive pointless truck in my neighborhood. So it's just I mean, I drive a small truck, so I'm not immune, but
Yeah, so it seems that there's a serious need for this masculinity to be somehow made bigger or
yes,
enhanced in a way.
tempered. Yeah. It would be nice if having stronger women helped that.
Yeah.
I'm not, I don't think necessarily setting up conflict between men and women is the answer, but I think having stronger women who are not so easily dominated might help.
Yeah. So yeah, in your work, you're interested in conflict and you approach conflict a bit in a way of political art, and you bring social engagement and art together.
Mhm.
And you do boxing. So you bring all this together in your exhibition and work. Could you talk about that? Why boxing? And why bringing boxing classes within your exhibitions?
Well, it's interesting. The first time that I brought a combat sport to an exhibition was in Detroit at the Museum of Contemporary Art there.
Yeah.
And I actually offered self-defense classes rather than boxing, because I am fully aware that, as I say, there are real victims and people need to defend themselves. I don't look at combat sports as purely for aggression. Sometimes it's for defensiveness too.
Yeah.
But I also love boxing and Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu and karate, all these combat sports as art forms as well. So the reason that I presented a ladies' Muay Thai fight night with my last New York City show was, number one, there was a sort of reason on the surface, which is that I wanted to present this paradigm of powerful, skillful, artful women in the center of a Chelsea gallery. And it was a packed night. There was a line down the block and hundreds of people didn't get in. It was just this incredible amount of excitement. So that was the reason on the surface. And then the subliminal reason was the fight crowd is very different from the art crowd. So it was a social experiment in that we got fight world people in with the gallery world. So it was different social classes, different ethnicities. Everybody was together looking at art books together and, screaming at the fights together and just generally having this visceral sensory experience together. And that was what I found most exciting about it, was that kind of collapse of social class and ethnicity.
And would you say there is also some kind of a collapse between the genders where they kind of start to blend more?
Yes, for sure. In that situation, for sure, it's a unifying experience to watch two people use all their art form, their Muay Thai art form. So the beauty of that can unify people. So yes, collapse between the genders. Although I don't think, I think I know that there were people who worked in the gallery who didn't want to see it too. Like, and I totally honor that. There are people of either gender who aren't drawn to combat sports, but I
Mm.
don't think it breaks down along gender lines. I think plenty of women like to watch fighting sports.
Yeah, yeah. So in your work, I feel there's a strong relationship to the body and skin.
Hmm.
Could you talk about that, how you use also your own body in your performances and videos? Because you're staging narrative, you are constructing narrative. Can you tell us like how you go about this?
Thank you for that question. Well, I don't know if you've seen this mud wrestling video that I did, but that
Yeah,
is the most body-oriented video possible. And
yeah,
there's a layer of American feminism that is quite anti-sex. And it just ends up being sort of, because it's anti-porn, it can kind of become anti-sex in a certain kind of way. And I come from more of a pro-sex movement. So that mud wrestling video was a way to engage the most sexy people I could. So the woman who was stronger than the other two was a retired porn star, and I just thought, let me make an actual sort of softcore porn where you got to admire their bodies and appreciate their bodies, but they weren't necessarily one woman was, I mean, younger than I am now, but older than the other two. So you could
yeah.
compare their bodies and enjoy all the sort of positions they got themselves into and the way the mud coated their skin. So it's just like a sensory experience in that way too.
Yeah, although it's fighting, there's something very sensual about it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, and I think the fact that you have bodies of different ages, it's very humbling and it can bring discomfort to some because, you know, as we get older, most women want to hide their body instead of showing it. And
Yes.
this is something very strong in society, how we have to start to hide our bodies and it becomes not right to show it. And so I think this is really important. There's also the video, the Amish video, where you put yourself in.
Yes. Well, it was a quarantine, so I had to use myself too. And that was my son and his then delightful girlfriend. And so we
Yes.
were quarantined in the woods, and she was part of our pod, as they say. So that video that was set up to be a narrative about who does more work. It was about who is going to carry more wood and who carries wood better and who
Yeah.
looks right doing the work and who looks wrong doing the work. So we alternated the boy and the girl carrying the wood. And then I have a scene of myself as the older women knitting, although I really don't know how to knit. So I just made a bunch of knots. I just posed as Whistler's mother by the fireplace in my old house. And then, of course, it ends with dumping the ash out of the wood they have labored
Yeah.
to. And in my mind, dumping the ash of my horrible knitting project out as well. It's about labor between the genders.
Yeah. So the video is entitled Pilgrim
Yeah.
Puritan Core. I'm curious why the Amish, why this
Because
subject?
they just so iconically Puritan looking, and it's a Puritan country. And the Amish, although they of course come from Germany and Holland, they retain this puritanical look to them. So that's why the costumes. And I wanted them to be iconically Puritan, but I also wanted to raise the question of, like, if you do the labor as you're supposed to, does that make you a Puritan? Or if you don't do the labor, does that make you a whore? Like, the kind of the connection between doing domestic labor and being a sexual being or a sexual product, or was one that I wanted to make in that video.
That's very interesting. In your work, you blur the lines between facts and fiction. Do you have a methodology?
Yes, I mean, in the 90s, it was a big question in photography because digital photography was just coming up. And so there were still the shreds of a belief in the truth of the medium of photography. And now that digital photography is so pervasive, I think it's more generally accepted that photography can be fictional. I still think that there is something to say about it, in the sense that I think that you can present one reality and have a completely different truth involved, or you can have propaganda where a picture looks like one thing to one person and one thing to another person. So I'm interested in all those questions. They're just fundamental to photography as far as I'm concerned. And the reason that I do make fictions, is because I simply don't, I do free shoot or do documentary shoot. I do take pictures a lot, but I don't, for me, they're not my artwork so much. They're more my Instagram, more for just
Yeah.
free shooting and being
Yeah.
a photographer like everyone else is a photographer. Now the entire world is a photographer. So the fictions are more my subjective point of view and observation. I do think there's always a grain of truth in them, and that's why I direct people heavily, because I feel like you can elicit real emotions through fictional techniques, and that's what I'm aiming for. So it's truth under the cover of fiction.
So what is your experience about being a woman and a mother in the arts?
Oh, a woman and a mother. Yes, gosh. When I actually backed into being a mother. I had a happy accident. I did not plan to be a mother, and I was very scared about it, and I didn't know very many mothers. And so when I was pregnant, I asked the painter Eva Lunziger, how do you do this? She had then, I think, 2 kids. And how do you do this? And did you have to give up your work? And did it ruin your life? Are you still an artist? All that stuff. And she just said this great thing to me, which she said she felt now she must make even better work for her kids. So it's been nothing but, inspiration for her. And I love that. I mean, the real facts are that it limits your time, but for me, photography doesn't require 7 days in a week with an oil painting, so I think it's a little bit easier for me.
Yeah.
At times it's defined my work. Like I made a long collage project when I was in the house with a newborn more. So, but I just feel like life defines your work for everybody. There's things happening in your life. You have to react and try to be productive no matter what.
You could say it was harmonious for you to bring the two together in parallel.
Yes, it was. And especially now I can even use my older son as a model. So
that is perfect. Yeah, really cool. Would you say it's right to say that through your work, you reveal the inner life of women?
Well, I don't want to speak. I don't want to presume to speak for all women, because I think I probably have a somewhat unique point of view. I think I'm a bit of a tomboy, and having grown up in the country, I have sort of slight like alienation from more urban points of view. So I can't speak for everyone at all, but I definitely speak for my inner life. And then I have found that it meets the way that other people also feel at times. That's my goal, is to create connection, of course.
So maybe we can talk about your series Moonbitches. There's a picture in it called Trunk Lab, where we see a trunk with a portable meth lab. So according to an interview in Bomb magazine, you said it was a typical housewife's economic support. Could you tell us why you're interested in this idea of the housewife and the economic support, and how did it came about to discover this reality that many people don't know?
It was this terrible fact that I read somewhere that over half, 50% of American women of meth labs were run by sort of stay-at-home moms. And so it just rang a bell with me that women have to do strange things when they have to take care of their kids. And that's obviously a negative example. It's very dangerous to have a meth lab, but it's also my twisted sense of humor that I think it's also funny to take the kind of iconic view of isn't it nice, the mother, and everyone smiles. It's fantastic, the mother. And I get a little disgusted with that type of false worship. And so it seemed to be like, let me make a bad mother and let me see what happens with a bad mother. And she's so beautiful with her tattoos and stuff. I find her so cool. So that's why.
Yeah. So what about your sense of humor? Because I feel your pictures have a lot of sense of humor, like the t-shirt where it says hysterical female. So you do bring a lot of humor in your work, even if it feels sometimes really serious.
Yeah, I find archetypes very silly. So like a hysterical woman archetype is silly. A puritanical archetype is silly. The sort of Madonna mother person I find silly. Like nobody is really like that. So that tends to be the sort of thing that I joke about. I'm glad that you recognize it as humor. I think sometimes people take me quite seriously, but that's also their right too. But yeah, I'm not a hysterical female.
Barbara Pola, the gallerist in Geneva, writes this about one of your photographs, Faye Silver. This mental space claims discordance, role reversal, a different vision of the word, and we understand that the use of the negative was essential here, as it brings to the image a form of lightness that contributes to the better containment of the depth of the subject. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that was so beautiful what she wrote.
Yeah.
I'll just appreciate for a moment how beautiful that was. And I especially appreciate that she understands why I use the negative. I don't often manipulate my photographs, but for that one in particular, putting a young girl, actually a disabled young girl, in a combat sports helmet and gloves was a reversal of what you would expect from the young girl. But if you just look at the picture, you don't necessarily know that she's disabled. So I needed to reverse it to sort of restate the fact that it's not what you expect.
Yeah. Could you tell us about your work, your series called Leonore, with the dancer that you met? So it was a life encounter, really. That's where it started,
yes.
right?
I know Eleanor from my combat sports gym, and her kicks were super interesting because she was a dancer. And so these kicks that you do on a bag in Muay Thai are very heavy and harsh, and hers were elegant at the same time. So I became interested in working with her, and she's just sort of goes across both categories of male and female. She's probably more feminine than me, so I really appreciate that aspect of her. She inhabits her femininity and sexuality very freely and comfortably. So I think that's what really drew me to her. I wanted to make beautiful photographs, and she's extremely beautiful too. So she agreed to perform for the camera for me, and we made very set up pictures. It was an appointment to make a very set up, beautiful picture with a beautiful girl, which is kind of a classic thing. But I like to think that she exudes this kind of strength within her femininity that's uniquely a young woman's strength and unique to her as well.
To talk about the photographs, you set her up in an environment with pieces of metal that represent masculinity in a way?
Masculinity, or just like a figure, generally, like a standard. Like, what is a standard figure? It's those pieces of metal. That's a body as you might imagine it in 2 dimensions in a photograph, in a black and white photograph. And then you put it next to a fully realized person in the flesh. So it was to provide that kind of sense of the generic versus the very, very specific.
And it has that contrast between the warmth of the body and the cold of the metal. Could we talk about gender fluidity and how you bring it out in your work?
Yes. I mean, it's interesting because my notion of gender comes very much from Judith Butler's idea of performative gender, in which you kind of are what you do. So that if I'm a woman, if I behave in womanly ways, theoretically that would make me female. Or if I'm a man and I behave in womanly ways, theoretically that would make me female as well. And I think that that's performative idea has been superseded by the notion of biological gender, or being, and then in terms of being trans, being born in the wrong body also. Those are more grounded biological concepts, even though being born in the wrong body, sometimes people don't believe that, which is insane, but because of course that happens. So all of that is to say that I believe that I do believe that you can define gender, you can behave according to whatever social conventions you choose to, whatever delights you. So if you're a biological woman, if it delights you to be extraordinarily feminine, that's fantastic. If it delights you to get rid of every feminine convention and be a straight cisgender woman who is a tomboy, like more like me, then that's also a different definition of woman. So you have the theoretical transsexual, and then you have the grounded one. So you also have, of course, trans people. So now I'm getting to an age where I think young people are going to speak their own truths about being transgender in a way that I am listening to, and I'm only listening to and learning from. I have a trans son, and I'll let him speak for himself. He doesn't want me to speak for him, but for sure, seeing people cross the gender lines because they really must has made me understand the gravity of how it is to be gender fluid for someone. For me as a woman, becoming more of a tomboy is no big deal. I think for a cisgender man to become feminine is a very big deal. They take a lot of trouble. So I rest on a kind of privilege of exhibiting masculine traits myself, but not really getting into trouble for it. And I think people take enormous risks to be who they are. So I honor that, and I recognize that as a difference from me.
It is true that in the history of our societies, when you think about it, we heard that a lot, I think, and everybody has, that, my parents wanted a boy, so I was a tomboy, or my dad raised me more as a boy, and that kind of is a thing that people hear. So somehow it become okay, but the opposite is not accepted. It's very hard for some men to understand that it goes both ways. And maybe some girl did not want to be a tomboy or be treated as boys, but some did. It was okay because it was accepted. Oh, that brings me to conclude that having this ability to be more fluid brings a lot of freedom to all of us. And your work is about freedom. Could you talk about this notion of freedom and what it represents for you?
I love that. Well, first of all, being an artist represents a lot of freedom because you can take whatever you're interested in and put it in the container of art. So I can put combat sports and gender and everything in the container of art and photography. So I definitely want to also, in presenting other paradigms of being female or other paradigms of being human, I want to add to people's freedom. Like, I really care about the idea of unfettered life, particularly for women. I have my particular point of view on what that is, but I also just care about it in general as a master plan, more and more freedom. And I actually feel like Leonore is an example of a younger person who experiences more and more freedom. That's why I'm interested in her. So we talk about it in a very kind of quasi-fascist way in America at the moment. Like, I don't have to get vaccinated for my freedom and so forth. So I'm cautious with the word, but in terms of artistic liberty and freedom, I'm there for it.
I like this idea of having a bit of a cause, through the work. And I think it's important because a lot of people are, as you said, unfeathered and in their life, and that's so important. How was your experience being a woman in the art world?
Yeah, I'm a little grumpy about some of the dollar differences between male and female prices. I'm a little grumpy I try not to be grumpy because you can only do so much. But as I get older, I'm a little more clear that some things you should be grumpy about. But I also got special treatment, particularly as a younger woman in the art world. And then as I've gotten older, I've made enormously valuable colleagues and friends, like actually Barbara Polo, who is a remarkable appreciator of women. So I think it's very special. It's very special. At times it pays less well, but that's okay.
So do you have a list of the top 3 things you are grumpy about?
Yeah, price differences. That's really the only thing that I'm grumpy about. I could be grumpy that young people get more attention, but you know what? Young people are magical and incredible, and of course they get more attention. So I'm not grumpy about that. I think that's fantastic. Of course, mid-career people should get more attention, but I also think there's some value to a quieter period in artwork, and I think you can make it through then and really make your work for yourself, and that's fantastic. So yeah, I only have the one grumpy thing. It's to do with prices.
This is a great word of wisdom, actually. Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. So nice to talk to you. Thank you for the great questions.
I'm so glad I get to share this conversation with you and hopefully inspire you in reflecting on those roles of women in our societies, on the idea of discomfort in regards to the roles we are expected to follow, and also in regards to our bodies. If you have any comments on this subject, or if you would like to share your ideas, please do so via email at hello@rawradical.com or by commenting on this episode's post on Instagram @rawradical. Can't wait to hear from you. This podcast is supported by Pro Helvetia, the Swiss Arts Council, the Republic and Canton of Geneva, and the city of Lancy in Switzerland. We are so thankful for their support and commitment to women, culture, and the arts. Thanks for listening to Raw and Radical Women in the Arts podcast. Learn more about our featured artists and sign up for news and updates by visiting our website rawradical.com.
Organic, radical, profound.
Please consider leaving us a comment and review on your preferred podcast listening platform to help others discover the show and take part in this global dialogue.
She, intuitive.
I am Maureen Broadbeck, and until next time, keep the dream alive.
Woman.